Plot summary of Baron Wenckheim's Homecoming by László Krasznahorkai, winner of the 2025 Nobel Prize in Literature. Style faithful condensation. Baron Bela Wenckheim, returning at last to the provincial town that had long ago regarded him less as a scion of aristocratic lineage and more as a rumor, now grown vague through time, that filtered through taverns and bus stops and the corridors of municipal offices where clerks kept their heads low and shuffled papers mechanically, while the scent of dust lay upon everything, so that even the notion of anticipation seemed fatigued before it could fully form for this town, had forgotten what it meant to expect anything at all. And yet there simmered a hardly confessed hunger beneath the daily gesture of routine, and it was into this atmosphere that news of the Baron's approach began to circulate. Not as an announcement, but as a persistent whisper arising from nowhere and everywhere, until the mayor himself, who had long spent his days maneuvering through bureaucratic inertia, rather than governing in any meaningful sense, nevertheless, please like and subscribe to our channel, perceived in the Baron's imminent arrival, an occasion to elevate his own standing before the townspeople, and so preparations began not through any coherent plan, but through a clumsy convergence of ambitions, as the Cultural Committee hastily convened an agenda to organize festivities, while teachers instructed students to practice patriotic songs without entirely recalling the lyrics, and local businessmen imagined how to convert this transient spectacle into personal gain, even as the older inhabitants remained skeptical, remembering all prior promises that had dissolved into the gray sameness of days. Indistinguishable from one another, meanwhile, the train that carried Baron Bela Wenckheim across the expanse of fields and dilapidated stations advanced with a slow inevitability for the Baron himself, exhausted by the long detour of his life, and the humiliations that had corroded his former glamour now gazed from the window, not in nostalgia, but in a state of numb vacancy, as though the land passing before him were merely a fading projection. And yet somewhere within him flickered the faint and unarticulated wish that his return might summon a brief sensation of tenderness or recognition, though he could not have confessed this even to himself, and the town, as it awaited him, seemed to sink deeper into a kind of anticipatory torpor, its narrow streets sagging under the dull afternoon light, while stray dogs wandered without aim, and the smell of stagnant water drifted from the outskirts, where an abandoned factory slouched into rust. And it was in this stagnant expectancy that the news at last reached the girl Marika, who once loved the Baron in their youth, and who now lived in a modest room above a florist's shop, where time had pressed its invisible weight upon her face, yet upon hearing of his return, she felt neither joy nor sorrow, but something more formless, a stirring of memory that she attempted to resist, but could not entirely suppress, and so the day inched forward, a laminar haze of preparation, hesitation, and concealed yearning, and the light over the low rooftops did not so much decline as sink into the surfaces of cracked plaster and peeling paint so slowly that even those few who stood in their doorways scarcely registered any shift, except for the almost imperceptible thickening of the air that always arrived before dusk, when faint sounds from the railway crossing would become strangely magnified. The distant clank of metal, the hollow reverberation of wheels over warped tracks, and within that spreading hush, the figure of an old man pushing a bicycle with a bundle of wilted vegetables, tied to the handlebar, advanced along the roadside as, though each step required careful negotiation with the ground beneath him, while in a window not far away, a woman paused in the act of folding linen, and for no reason she could name held the cloth pressed against her cheek, as if listening for some tremor of change that might emanate from its worn fibers. And thus the town settled into its habitual posture of waiting, yet this waiting carried an unfamiliar density, as though the air itself were thickened by the unspoken knowledge that something long dormant was inching nearer, though no one could name it, and least of all could the Baron, who sat in the dim train compartment, his hands resting loosely upon his knees, unsure whether the faint trembling, he felt belonged to the motion of the train or to his own body, remembering without quite remembering a corridor from his childhood, where light fell across the tiled floor in a pattern he could no longer fully summon. Yet the effort to summon it held him motionless as the train continued toward the town that had ceased to expect anything, even as it now waited for him for the station toward which the train approached, possessed none of the ceremonial attributes that might greet a returning nobleman, but rather stood half-sunken in creeping vegetation with its wooden awning warped by rain and years of neglect, where a single light bulb flickered in daytime, though too weak to cast illumination, yet persistent enough to suggest a stubborn refusal to be extinguished, and the station-master, an elderly man whose uniform had long lost any definition of shape or color, moved with such unhurried gestures that each motion appeared detached from intention, as if he were not performing tasks, but merely repeating faint echoes of tasks remembered from a period when they still had meaning. And through the wavering glass of the station window, he could see two sparrows pecking at discarded crumbs among cigarette butts, their tiny movements nervous and erratic, while beyond them, the road lay empty except for a solitary bus like a relic abandoned mid-journey, its windows clouded by dust and its tires half deflated, and in another corner of town, the mayor rehearsed under his breath a clumsy greeting he imagined delivering to the Baron, though he altered it with each repetition, never finding a formulation that did not sound either excessively formal or embarrassingly servile, and his secretary, meanwhile, sorted through papers at a desk yellowed by the residue of countless cigarettes, attempting to ignore the uneasy conviction that the arrival of this Baron would not, in fact, simplify anything but would rather summon new complications, whose shape could not yet be discerned. And yet the preparations continued with the same lethargic momentum that characterized every civic effort in this town, so that even those who sensed the futility of these gestures could not refrain from participating as though compelled by a force that did not derive from hope, but from a habit so deeply ingrained. It resembled inertia, and it was at precisely this hour when the edges of all visible things began to blur, not into darkness, but into a kind of suspended dimness that lacked any decisive boundary between fading light and impending night, that the Baron himself within the train felt an almost bodily recognition of this atmosphere, though he could not have said why, only that the rhythm of the wheels against the track seemed to merge, with some ancient pattern of memory long buried, yet now resurfacing with such faintness that it was less an image than the sensation of an image forming behind the eyelids before sleep, and this sensation carried with it not comfort, but a tremulous unease, as though the land itself into which he was being drawn possessed a will that exceeded any human intention and far ahead within the town. Marika had descended the narrow stairs from her room above the florist and stood behind the glass door of the shop, where the mingled scent of wilted carnations and damp earth drifted through the air, and though she had not resolved to wait for him, she remained motionless, gazing toward the street that lay nearly deserted, except for a boy kicking a bottle cap along the gutter, his motions without enthusiasm, as if even play here could only be enacted through a veil of exhaustion, and in that stillness, which was not silence but the accumulation of barely audible sounds, the rustle of leaves, the faint creak of an unlatched shutter, the distant cough of an unseen passer-by, the town seemed to draw one long, slow breath, awaiting without knowing that it awaited the moment when the train would at last arrive, bearing the figure it had forgotten, yet could not entirely erase from its collective and half-dreaming mind. And the train now reduced its speed as though reluctant to intrude upon this town, where even the motion of arrival seemed an act too abrupt for the prevailing tempo of existence. And the Baron, leaning forward ever so slightly, felt not anticipation but an increasing heaviness within his chest, as though the air that awaited him outside the carriage were thicker, colder, denser than what circulated here, and he closed his eyes not in an effort to rest, but because the indistinct shapes beyond the window did not yet cohere into forms, He recognized, and in that darkness behind his eyelids, there flickered brief fragments of his earlier life, not in sequence but as isolated sensations. A gloved hand brushing against his when he once entered a ballroom lit by chandeliers, whose light trembled against the mirrored walls. The echo of distant laughter that even then had carried a note of merciless amusement. The shimmer of playing cards upon a velvet table, yet these recollections dissolved before attaining clarity, leaving only that same unnameable unease while, at the station, the old station-master stepped onto the platform, his movements deliberate to the point of seeming ceremonial. Though nothing about this scene possessed the dignity of ceremony, and, through the door, the Baron appeared not as a figure of distinction, but as a man faintly disoriented by the simple act of standing upon the earth of his birthplace, and in that instant the town, without knowing it, inhaled again, as if adjusting itself to accommodate the return of a presence that had long been erased from its visible order, yet persisted like a watermark beneath the worn surface of its days. And the Baron, now stepping from the station into the narrow street, found the air of the town not altered by his absence, yet not entirely indifferent to it, for windows that once framed his youthful face now framed only the slowly sagging facades and the occasional silhouette of a neighbor observing without intention. And he walked with a gait neither hurried nor idle, feeling the slight unevenness of the cobblestones beneath his shoes, the texture of which spoke more to memory than to present use, and the scent of baking bread from a distant oven mingled with the faint odor of soot. And the town seemed to stretch in slow increments, as though each building were aware of his return and made no immediate acknowledgement. The end. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe to our channel.